Thank you, Shafi, for that introduction, and thank you everyone for coming. I think I'll start by giving you a brief overview of what to expect this evening. We have a very distinguished panel with us, so let me start by first telling you who they are briefly, and then I'll do a detailed introduction for each panelist when they get up to speak about their work. So, there it is. We have Professor Celeste Kidd. She is a professor of psychology at UC Berkeley. Professor Bruno Olshausen, neuroscientist at UC Berkeley. Michael Pollan, who's a professor at UC Berkeley, Graduate School of Journalism, and also, for the purposes of this evening, author of How to Change Your Mind. And then we have Professor Christos Papadimitriou. He's a computer scientist from Columbia University who's just flown in from New York. So I will tell you more about each panelist in a little bit. But what I want to do is just give you a sense of what to expect this evening. We will start with each panelist speaking briefly, 5 to 7 minutes, about their work as it pertains to the topic of this evening, which is the predictive brain. And I'll come to what we mean by the predictive brain in a moment. And then once each panelist is done giving us an introduction to their research in the context of the predictive brain, we will have a Q&A session amongst the panelists, which I will help moderate. And then once we're done with that discussion, then we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. So that's kind of the structure of the evening. And it would be lovely if you have questions that come up in your mind to just wait until we get to the last 20 minutes, 25 minutes, so that we can get you the mics and you can speak into the mic. I think this is getting recorded, so yeah, so that's the structure of the evening. And what are we here this evening for? We're basically trying to ask this question and try and understand, how does the brain perceive? There's a neuroscientist in the UK, he's a namesake of mine, his name is Anil, who has a very lovely way of illustrating this problem, and I'm going to steal his words. So imagine the quandary of being a brain. Imagine the problem of being a brain, this 3-pound mass of tissue stuck inside a bony skull with a few holes from which there's information coming in from the outside and from within your body. And it has to make sense of this information and create a really vivid perceptual experience that each one of us right now is having. So how is that possible? And that's a really big question in neuroscience. And one of the ways in which you can think the brain might be doing this is by saying, okay, maybe it's just getting all the information in and somehow from the bottom up constructing this percept that, so the information that is coming in is rich with details, and it's somehow extracting all those details and constructing a perception of the world that you're in and also of your own body. It turns out that this is not quite how the brain might be doing it, because it's, and I think Bruno will get to why this might be not the way to think about how the brain creates perceptions. Over the last 2 or 3 decades, there has been a shift in thinking about how the brain might be creating perceptions. And this is the topic of the evening. It's the idea that, it's an idea that actually goes back a long way, all the way to Plato, then Kant, and then most significantly to a 19th century German physiologist called Hermann von Helmholtz. Helmholtz basically argued that the way the brain creates perceptions is by making inferences about the most likely cause of the inputs that are falling on your eyes and ears and body. So it's essentially trying to predict what might be the cause of the inputs that you're receiving. Right? So this is what we mean by prediction. By prediction, we are not saying that we are predicting the future. The brain is basically taking a certain set of information, prior information that it has about the world outside and about the body, and then uses that information to make a probabilistic judgment about what might be the cause of the inputs that are falling on your eyes, your ears, your skin, etc. And that's essentially the topic that we're going to dig into throughout the course of this evening, that perception is an act of inference. It's an inference about the most likely, the most probable cause of the inputs that you're receiving. And if all this sounds a bit esoteric, I want to play a little game with you. And this will really illustrate how amazing this concept is. So there are 2 examples. In each example, there are 3 audio clips. The first clip that you will hear is something called a sine wave speech. It is a degraded form of an actual snippet of sound. And when you hear it, it won't sound like anything at all except just a series of beeps and tones. It will actually sound like R2D2. And then the next clip that we'll play is the actual speech from which this degraded waveform was created, right? So you will hear what the speech is. And then we'll play the degraded waveform all over again. And I want you to pay attention to what you perceive when the degraded waveform is played all over again. So I'm hoping this works now. So this will be the first degraded speech. How many of you figured out what that was? Okay, somebody has got a very good ear. But okay, this is the actual sound, actual speech.
It was a sunny day and the children were going to the park.
Right? Now listen to this.
It was a sunny day and the children were going to the park.
Right? Did everyone hear what?
Yeah, my question is how did that person...
Can you hang on for the question? We'll come back to that.
This is related, though. This is related because she said she heard it. So did she? Let's ask her.
Well, we'll figure it out. We'll ask her later. Let me get through. We have a lot of stuff to get through, and we'll come back to questions. Keep that in mind, and yeah. You remember it. So, and another example, right? So this is. Anyone? Okay, this time no one. Thank God. Okay. All right. Here's the
He was sitting at his desk in his office.
Right. So what happened? When you heard the degraded speech, both times the input waveform falling on your ears is exactly the same. There's no more or no less information. But something changed when you heard the speech, and that change happened in your brain. So there was before you heard the actual speech, there was no prior information about what that speech was, and then your brain's prior information about what you're going to hear changed, and then now it was able to predict what is the most likely cause of the waveform that you just heard, right? So this was an example of something that the brain is doing. It's predicting. And we're going to now get stuck into this, hopefully, quite a lot. So I'm going to start by introducing you to Bruno. So Bruno Olshausen is a professor in the Helen Wills Neuroscience Institute and School of Optometry. He also directs the Redwood Center for Theoretical Neuroscience, which is a multidisciplinary research group focusing on building mathematical and computational models of brain function. Bruno started as an engineer wanting to build robots inspired by how brains work. Bruno, I've stolen this from your website. And ended up as a neuroscientist attempting to understand how nervous systems process information, inspired and guided by engineering principles. His research is focused on understanding how the brain builds representations of 3D surfaces, material properties, objects, and motion from the voltage fluctuations of photoreceptors in the retina. Somehow, nature has figured out a solution to this daunting problem, and Bruno wants to reverse engineer nature's solution to solve this puzzle. So, Bruno, please, the floor is yours.
All right. So I think I'd like to just make 2 main points to start off with. The first is that one of the biggest myths of visual perception is that what you experience in perception is just the image at the back of your eye, the retinal image. And the second is that what you do perceive is a story that's conjured by your brain. And it's essentially an internal model of the world that you build in order to function in the world, to reason about it, to plan actions, and so forth. And this is something that your brain constructs. And it's all constantly making predictions about the sensory input and using these predictions, the match or mismatch between these predictions to help build up its model of the world. And so I'll try to make this point through 2 specific examples. One is the perception of stability in the face of moving images on the retina. And the second is the inference of a very detailed 3-dimensional structure from ambiguous figures, which is kind of like the visual analog of what Anil just showed you for sound. So let's go to the first. So the first is just this, what the image shows here is depiction of the cones in your eye, in the retina. And this is from Austin Rorda's lab, where they have the technology to be able to actually see through the living human eye and image individual cones. Each one of those dots is a cone. You can think of these essentially as the pixels of the camera in your eye. And so what you can see is kind of grainy, they're kind of irregularly spaced. But what's even more dramatic is what happens when you look at some object in the world. So when you look at some, how do I advance this? Okay. So when you look at an object, your eye is constantly moving. So even though you're trying to hold your eye still, there's this constant drift that's happening there in the eye. And so the size of this letter here, this E, is about the same size as the letters on the lowest row of a Snellen eye chart. So when you look at the eye chart in the eye doctor's office, right, and those letters on the lowest row you can read if you have 20/20 vision, and this is how big they would appear on the retina. So what's really remarkable about this is that when you're looking at this as the subject, that E does not appear to be moving. Okay? It looks like it's rock solid and stable in the world. And the second remarkable thing is that you can read the E. Right? You can make sense of it, even though the structure on which it's defined is on the same scale of the cones there. So another way of thinking about this is that you're not aware of the pixels here in your retina. You can't see the pixels, and you can't see the motion. And so one thing that neuroscientists kind of debate and think about a lot is this aspect of fixation, is this a feature or is it a bug? Is this just because of poor design in biology, or is it a good thing? And we actually think it's a good thing, that the visual system does this for a reason, and it actually helps you build a higher acuity representation, a model, an internal model of what's going on in the world, even though the data coming in. It's even noisier than this because that data is coming in the form of spikes or action potentials, which are sort of punctate all or nothing sort of digital events coming in through the optic nerve. Okay. So to do this, we have constructed a mathematical model based on Bayesian inference. So it's essentially a mathematical model that tries to construct some kind of internal estimate of what's going on out there in the world based on all these spikes coming in from the eye. This is the work of Alex Anderson, who is a Ph.D. student in my lab. And so this is what's being shown here as a graphical model. I was kind of be able to point. Okay, so maybe I have to point at a few things from here. So it's constructed as a graphical model. And what's coming in from your eye are these things R. That stands for the spike rate, the spiking neuron responses that are coming from the eye. And time is going from left to right here. And what your brain is trying to estimate is the pattern on there on the retina. So what you're looking at. And that's assumed to be constant. You're assuming that there's some shape there that's not changing in the world. And you're trying to estimate what that is from these noisy, kind of unstable spikes happening. At the same time, you have to estimate the motion. So you're trying to track this thing, how it's moving. For those of you familiar with Kalman filters from engineering, which are also based on Bayesian inference, this is not unlike that. It's a similar kind of inferential process. Okay, so this is just showing then a simulation of that process happening. So if you just show as a, oops, I have to press twice. Okay. I don't know if it's stuck. Okay, here we go. Okay. So it's just a simulation of this process happening where we're going to simulate here an E moving across your cone array, so kind of a irregularly spaced array of cones. And by the way, I forgot to mention, one reason why we think this is good is because it allows your brain to average over the idiosyncrasies in your cone lattice. So each of those cones has different gain factors, they have different wavelength selectivities. And so if you didn't do this, then the E would sort of appear differently depending on where it lands and which cones it lands on the retina. So the idea is by moving it across the retina, you can actually sort of average across this appearance and obtain a higher quality estimate. So that's what you're going to see here in this animation is just a simulation of that E moving across. What's being shown here in the middle panel as a simulation of the spikes coming in from your retina from the on cells and from the off cells. So this is what your brain gets to look at. This is the data that's coming in. Okay, so it's not like if there's a homunculus in your brain, it's not like the homunculus can kind of just look at the spikes and tell what's going on, right? It has to make an inference based, it's kind of sophisticated. Okay, and so what's being shown here is an estimate of the pattern. This is sort of your internal model of what you think is going on. And you're building this up by simultaneously estimating the motion. That's being shown here on the right, tracking the motion, building up this estimate, and at the same time, making this estimate of the pattern. Okay, and so essentially you're kind of pulling two rabbits out of a hat. Just from these spikes, you're estimating these two things simultaneously and using one to infer the other. So what this does is it gives us a model that allows us to understand then why it is so that acuity actually does improve from moving stimuli across the retina. That's been shown in experiments in Austin's lab, that moving a stimulus actually helps you And it helps you out even more when you have cone loss. So there's some subjects that have as many as 50% of their cones missing, and they actually have normal visual acuity. Okay, and this gives us a way of reasoning about how that can be, because if the eye is constantly in motion, it allows the object to sort of move in and out of these zones of bad pixels and good pixels. So if you just sort of planted the E in one location, this is what you would get. But if you're allowed to move it across and track it and average its appearance, then you can build up a much higher quality percept. Okay, so the second demonstration I want to show is the inference of 3D shape from ambiguous images. So these are what people used to call puzzle pictures. And so we have there's an object, some form here. And for those of you who've seen this before, please be quiet. Don't say what you think it is. So for those of you who have not seen this before, then this will probably just look like a bunch of black and white splotches in the image. And one way of interrogating your brain about what you see is to ask you to draw it. And so if we ask a subject to draw what they see, this is what one particular person drew, which is simply the outline of the sort of black and white regions in the scene. So how many of you would draw something like this if asked to kind of represent what was there? So about maybe, okay, so good fraction of you, okay. And so now I'm going to tell you what's there. It's a cow. And once I've told you this, it will completely destroy it. You'll never be able to see it like you saw it the rest of your life. Okay, so it's a cow. And so there's an eye here. There's an eye here. This is the snout. This is the head of the cow. Okay. So now, hopefully a lot of you see it. So now you take the same subject and ask them to draw what they see. And this is what they draw. Okay? So the question is, where did this come from? It came from inside your head. Right? This is what's actually on your retina. This is the data that's coming in. This is all the right you have to see. I mean, you have no right to say this, right? Just based on the data, right? You're just creating a story, right? You're extrapolating way beyond the data. It's not that you just see the 2D outline of the cow. You can sort of perceive all kinds of aspects of the three-dimensional structure of the scene. For example, you can tell that's sort of an indented part of the nose here. The three-dimensional structure of the snout. Perhaps you know that the head here is in front of the body. The body's kind of in the background. Moreover, the graininess here you would probably attribute to a photographic process, something in front of the scene, not part of the cow itself. I can separate across all these different layers. So there's an enormous amount of detail and richness in this scene. And the last question I'm going to sort of leave you with is, where is this inside your head? It's inside all these different boxes. These boxes are basically a depiction of the 30 or so different visual areas you have in your visual cortex. And what's kind of remarkable to think about here is that these boxes here are huge, but this is not where the cow itself lives in the sense of like the identity of the cow. What we know from neuroscience is that these are sort of more related to image properties, and the sort of abstract notion of the cow is kind of up here, and the details are kind of down here, the details you see in the instant. And I think that what's very important to convey, this is sort of in contrast to deep learning architectures, where in those kind of architectures, all of this is in service to the top box. And I think the way we work is that the representation of what you see in a given instance is really distributed hierarchically across all these layers, and it's all these together that constitute your percept of the scene. All right, so great.
Well, thank you, Bruno. So next we have Professor Celeste Kidd. Celeste is assistant professor in Department of Psychology at UC Berkeley. She has a Ph.D. in Brain and Cognitive Sciences from the University of Rochester and BAs in both linguistics and journalism. She came to Berkeley after research stints at Rochester, Stanford, and MIT. She studies processes involved in knowledge acquisition, especially in young children, using a combination of computational and behavioral methods. Her lab designs behavioral experiments to empirically differentiate between competing theories of how humans, particularly babies, learn, by measuring how learners pay attention and explore throughout the process of learning. Have I got that right?
That's great.
Celeste's work has been featured widely in the media, including The New Yorker. She was Time Magazine's Person of the Year in 2017, a collective honor that was given to the quote-unquote silence breakers, women and men who spoke out against sexual harassment and launched a movement. And Celeste will speak about some aspects of the predictive brain from the perspective of a developing mind.
That's right. As again, in Bruno's terms, I'm going to talk about where the cow comes from. That was a nice segue because a lot of the work that we do in our lab is with infants. So it's like infants are born into the world not knowing about the existence of things like cows. And a mystery is how they go from knowing very little about what exists in the world. You need to know what exists in the world in order to make predictions. We know that it's an important part of perception to have concepts like cows. So the question is where does that come from? And one widely believed in theory is that babies possess a very simple but very powerful mechanism for learning things that don't start as complex as cows, but build up to become as complex as cows. Babies enter the world with the ability to track co-occurrence statistics or statistical regularities, and they can use those in order to make sense of the world down the road. I want to talk about a great example of this that helped convince everybody that this is how babies are operating, and that's work by Jenny Safran and two of her colleagues, Dick Aslan and Lissa Newport. They were interested in how infants solve a particular problem. That problem was speech segmentation. We are all in this room, probably, who've come to this talk, pretty good language users at this point. So it might not be an obvious problem, but speech, when you are hearing it, has a property that's easy to overlook once you are fluent, but that a baby has to figure out, which is that it's continuous. So it's like there's no breaks between the words, unlike words that are on a written page. So they were interested in how babies go from this continuous stream of speech to eventually knowing where the words are, which is the first step that they need to solve in order to learn everything else about the language, to learn the grammar or to learn what the words themselves refer to. So they had an idea, which is maybe babies are using the statistical regularities in speech streams in order to solve this task. If you consider a phrase like pretty baby, a baby that doesn't have any experience with language doesn't know from just that sequence of syllables where the words are, or even how many there are. That could be 4 words, that could be 1 word, or anything in between. But if you listen to more language and you're tracking the statistics across the syllables, you can do something really cool. So you consider these four utterances. Maybe a baby hears pretty mama and pretty kitty and starts to notice, when I hear pre, T is very likely to follow. That sort of moves as a unit. Maybe that's where 1 word is. The baby keeps listening and hears things like happy baby, silly baby, and notices that baby also seems to track as a unit. And maybe that's how they break into solving this problem. So to test this, they created a nonsense language that looks something like this. It's hard to make sense of at first glance, so I'll tell you a little bit about how they constructed it. They made up novel words that were these 3-syllable units, and then they played this for 7- and 8-month-old infants for just 2 minutes. And what they wanted to know is if babies are able to track the statistics across these syllables, will they notice where the units are? Will they notice what syllables move together? And sure enough, babies were able to show that they treated these 2 different types of units from the sequence differently. The things that track together, the words, they were less interested in those. They were most interested in these part words, which is consistent with an account where those things were unexpected. They had learned in just 2 minutes that from this, stream that seems like nonsense to us, what moves together and what doesn't. So this was some of the first, and I think still some of the most powerful evidence that infants are capable of tracking statistics in the world and using those for gaining high-level concepts like where the words are. There's more, though. A few years later, Joseph Heiser and Dick Aslan did some similar work to see whether infants could employ that same statistical learning mechanism in order to learn not just about auditory sequences, but visual information. They did an experiment that was very similar, except instead of having a lexicon of auditory units, they were visual units that moved around. And in this visual scene, with just a few minutes of exposure again, infants demonstrated that they knew which shapes moved together and which shapes did not. They formed sort of a mini lexicon of these visual sequences. One last piece of evidence that I think is very powerful for showing the importance of co-occurrence statistics and how you can get very rich inferences from this very simple mechanism. There's some work by Scott Johnson that shows that babies also track co-occurrence and use that to form high-level concepts for things that involve movement. So if you consider a display like this, let's see if I can make it move. Adults, probably all of you, have the intuition about what shape is behind that occluding bar right there. You are generating a prediction about what that is with partial information. I was like, you can't see behind that blue bar. So Scott Johnson wanted to know whether infants could do that. It could be that there's one solid bar. That's what most adults think. But it also could be that there are two bars that just by some incredible coincidence are moving at exactly the same rate in exactly the same way. And if you test 3-month-olds' expectations, you'll find that they don't have that same bias that you have. They do not always expect that there's a solid bar. Sometimes they expect that it is two pieces. But by 4 months, or 5 months, it's like they've generated the same adult-like representations, presumably by tracking these statistics. So hopefully, I've introduced you to the concept of statistical learning. It's a very powerful domain general learning mechanism that could potentially explain how infants learn everything from words, object properties, up to high-level, more sophisticated concepts like cows. And that's very important because although the mechanism is simple, just tracking statistics across things, it builds. So initially, you can use statistical learning in order to figure out that the word apple is a unit that moves together. But you can use that same mechanism in order to solve the next level of problem, which is once you know that there is a word apple, you have to figure out what in the world is an apple. You have to solve the mapping problem. So noticing co-occurrence statistics between a spoken word and what is visually present is one of the mechanisms we know that infants employ in this task. And you do that, you keep building, you learn more sophisticated properties like who likes apples and who doesn't, also through similar mechanisms, and eventually you get things like cows. Yeah, so I was very hand-wavy on that part. I assume you guys are going to solve. I was like in between that slide and this one, you guys got it.
Yeah.
One final point I want to wrap up on. This is not just an important mechanism for understanding how kids make expectations about things that exist in the world, but also for understanding how they generate expectations about where they should go for learning. That's the topic that my lab works on primarily. Kids have an incredible task ahead of them. They have to go from knowing nothing to knowing all of the stuff that you know right now. And that process involves making predictions about where you are going to learn the best. We know that that's something that infants do. I think there's a tendency to think of them as sort of passive sponges, especially when you own one. You're worried about putting exactly the right thing in front of them. You don't have to have that worry, at least. I was like, there's lots of other worries, like them choking, that you can focus on. That's a real one. Babies are born with all sorts of very sophisticated mechanisms for not just generating expectations about what's an apple, but also figuring out where they can make the best use of their time. We know that they generate expectations about the statistical properties of the world, and possibly the most important thing that they use that for is deciding where they're going to look and where they're not. I was like, what toy they're going to pick up and play with and which one they're not, who they're going to play with and who they're not, and then eventually who they're going to lecture, which lecture they're going to listen to and which one they're going to fall asleep in. Yeah, thanks.
Well, thank you, Celeste. So maybe at this point, something is becoming clear, right? When our brains are making predictions, about the likely causes of sensory inputs in order to create perceptions, they are relying on internal representations of the outside world and of the body. And these internal representations might be coming about, hardwired, so like potentially this ability to figure out the statistics is some sort of ability that's already there in infants, but then that is being used to build more sophisticated representations of the outside world. And sometimes these representations can be wrong, or sometimes these predictions can go wrong, and that's kind of leading us to our next speaker. So Michael Pollan probably needs no introduction to a Berkeley crowd, but I will introduce him nonetheless. Michael is an author who writes, in his own words, about the places where nature and culture intersect, on our plates, in our farms and gardens, and in our minds. He's the author of numerous New York Times bestsellers, including The Botany of Desire and The Omnivore's Dilemma. His books have won a number of awards, and some have been adapted for television and shown on Netflix and PBS. In addition to the awards for his books, Michael has won many other awards. Really, there's too many to mention here, but I will just name two. In 2009, he was named by Newsweek as one of the top 10 new thought leaders. In 2010, he was named to the Time 100, which is the Time magazine's annual list of the world's 100 most influential people. In addition to writing for the New York Times Magazine, Michael has written extensively for the New Yorker, Harper's Magazine, where he was executive editor from '84 to '94, National Geographic, Mother Jones, New York Review of Books, Vogue, among others. And I'm not done. Michael is currently the Louis K. Chan Arts Lecturer and Professor of the Practice of Nonfiction at Harvard. And since 2003, he has held the John S. and James L. Knight Professor of Journalism at UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism. And today he is here to share with us ideas that appear in his latest bestseller, his new book, How to Change Your Mind, What the New Science of Psychedelics Teaches Us About Consciousness, Dying, Addiction, Depression, and Transcendence. And Michael will talk about psychedelics, I'm hoping from a first-person perspective, and tell us what that might, what light that might shed on the brain's predictive mechanisms. So, Michael?
Thank you, Anil. No. Save it. So I got very interested in the predictive brain, which I knew nothing about when I started this project. I am so much, my expertise is like at such a different level. I can't believe I'm here with this group. But I was trying to understand the psychedelic experience. Predictive coding turns out to be one interesting way into understanding that experience. Now, for me, trying to understand what is this predictive brain, not having the benefit of listening to these lecturers, this example, which is a famous example, helped me understand it. So watch this mask as it rotates, and something kind of interesting happens. So basically, as that mask goes around, it goes from being convex to concave. But you saw how it popped out. Your brain would not let you see a face as concave for very long, because faces aren't. You've learned from a very young age, probably while your parents were holding you, that faces are not concave. And there's an example where your brain is overriding the information with a prediction that it's so confident of. And I had heard that in the case of two classes of people, schizophrenics and people tripping, this doesn't happen. There's a lot of literature about schizophrenia. It's one of the tests for schizophrenia. So in fact, if you saw the back of that mask and it didn't pop out, see your doctor. In the case of, but I had heard, there's a researcher in Germany who'd done this research, and apparently people who are tripping, it also doesn't pop out. That they actually get a more faithful version of reality. So I thought I should test this. And as part of my book, I won't go into great detail, but as a responsible researcher, I felt I had to have a series of psychedelic experiences. And in one of them, and this was a high-dose psilocybin trip, I brought my computer loaded with that image into the treatment room. And at various points along the way, I ran that video. the experiment was a disaster. The first thing that happened was that imagery you saw, that kind of black and white computer-generated imagery, infected the whole experience. Everything I saw, I was in a black and white video game. It was just awful. And then I would stop and do this, and nothing happened. And then finally, when I reached kind of the peak of the experience, and I had my 4 grams of mushrooms, I did it again. I was really optimistic it was going to happen. And the thing turns, and it just melted in front of my face. There was no mask anymore. So all of which is to say, it remains, I haven't proven to myself that this is true, but there is this German researcher who's done this test and claims it's true. Now, the collapse of priors, or the collapse of predictive coding, it may be one of the values of psychedelics to neuroscience and computer science is that by disturbing a system, sometimes you can understand it better. And certainly psychedelics disturb the system of the predictive brain. But not in a predictive way, oddly enough. And I looked at this question talking to some neuroscientists working on it in England. And when your predictions break down, one of 2 things can happen. One is you actually get more information from the world in a very raw state that isn't being shaped by prediction, like you can see that the face is actually concave. And there are various examples of kind of information, whether it's musical or visual, coming through in a more raw, accurate state. The doors of perception, as Huxley said, have been opened wider. But then there's another phenomenon. As all this data comes in, the mind is overwhelmed. And what does a mind overwhelmed by data do? Generates new predictions. And they're really crazy. So you get this situation of seeing faces in the rain. Or patterns come out of fields that don't actually have a pattern, because the brain is so eager to restore visual prediction and oral prediction. And that may explain something that's going on with hallucination, that there is either too much information or not enough information, and the brain just starts projecting things. It could be a paranoid delusion, too, could be one of them. One of the interesting questions, maybe we'll take it up later, is at what scale can you scale up predictive coding and the predictive brain to other kinds of stories? I think you used the word story, that we're telling ourselves a story with these predictions to other things. We're all kind of trapped in narratives that we use when we enter a social situation, like I can't get through this dinner without a drink, right? Or I'm unworthy of love, I'm depressed, I have this projection that I put over the situation, and therefore I can't imagine there is love coming toward me. And you know, I think the model at the granular level we've been talking about may apply up. And one of the useful things about psychedelics, and why they're proven very useful in therapy now, is that they break down those stories and give you a chance to create new stories. New predictions about who you are, what you need, what your, how you deal with social situations. And there was a very nice metaphor that one of the neuroscientists I interviewed, a Dutch guy named Mendel Kalin, said that think of your brain as a hill, and your thoughts as sleds going down that hill. The more those sleds go down the hill, the deeper the grooves become. And it becomes, at a certain point, very difficult to go down the hill without getting drawn into the attractor of those grooves. And those grooves can be bad habits, patterns of thought, assumptions about reality, predictions. And as he put it, the value of psychedelics is, metaphorically, is that they're like a fresh snowfall that fills all the grooves, giving you the freedom to bring your thoughts down on another path. So I found that was a very helpful way to think about it. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So our next speaker is Professor Christos Papadimitriou. Like I said earlier, he's just come in from New York. He's a professor of computer science at Columbia University. and one of the world's leading computer science theorists. He's best known for his work in computational complexity. He has also explored other fields through what he calls the algorithmic lens, and has contributed to biology and the theory of evolution, economics and game theory, artificial intelligence, robotics, and more recently, the study of the brain. And then in his spare time, he has authored 5 textbooks and has written 3 novels, including one that you would be familiar with here in Logic Comics, and his latest, Independence. And then when in the other time that he has taught at UC Berkeley for 20 years, and before that at Harvard, MIT, the National Technical University of Athens, Stanford, and UC San Diego. Christos has been awarded the Knuth Prize, IEEE's John von Neumann Medal, the IEEE Computer Society Charles Babbage Award, and the Gödel Prize. So Christos, please.
Thank you. That was 22 years, by the way. But, so I know what you're all thinking. I thought that computer scientists study the computer. How come this guy is going to speak about the brain? And you are right. For the longest time, we have been studying the computer. We're obsessed with the computer. I was obsessed with the computer. We were so obsessed with the computer that we named our discipline after it, okay? So, but about 25 years ago, something happened. The internet was here, and as a result, that was a liberating moment, okay? We looked at each other and we said, we don't have to study the computer. And so we study the universe, okay, really. I mean, so this is what we have been thinking ever since. I mean, and basically, the real reason is this, okay, that we have learned a few things while studying the computer. We had developed a craft, a way of thinking that is different. And what happens is that when you study another problem, there are computer scientists now who are doing, in this room, who are doing quantum theory, statistical physics, biology and evolution, social, economic and social sciences, and ultimately the brain. And how do we do this? Basically, it was a liberating moment, like what happened when in the 17th century, Leibniz and Newton told mathematicians, it's not the triangles and the circles, you stupid, okay? It's the universe, okay? You can use our craft to study everything, right? Physics, mechanics, and so on. So, and the trick is, in the computer science world, is that you close your eyes and you try to fantasize that the scientific object you are dealing with, be it the market, the cell, a bunch of particles, the brain, that this object is trying to compute something, okay? And then interesting things happen often. Not always, not even almost always, but they do happen, okay? And this is, incidentally, this is a huge part of, as Shafi told us, a huge part of the mission of the Simon system. And so, ultimately, I arrived at the brain. And, studying the brain entails getting this book, okay? So this is something between an encyclopedia and a Bible, okay? So and basically, it's reprinted every 5 years, and it gets 200-page faster every. And if you think about it, it's principles of neural science, and principles should not grow, right? I mean, when the Greeks decided to find the principles that entail all of mathematics, in the end they came up with 4 lines, right? I mean, so this is not right, okay? So. The fact is that despite the amazing explosion in experimental data and even insights into the brain, we are no closer to basically solving the ultimate question, which the overarching question being, how does the brain beget the mind? Okay, so let me in the words of one of my heroes in this epic. We do not have a logic for the transformation of neural activity into thought and action. Okay, so And frankly, this is a very challenging thing, okay? Because this man, Richard Axel, thinks that this is what we should all be working on. And I'm asking you, okay, and I hope that with these narratives, a short narrative, I'll give you an example of what I mean by this, sort of how computer scientists can offer something in this endeavor. So, what do you think? What would be such a formal system? And I'll tell you about an idea I have. We have. So I'm working with other computer scientists, neuroscientists, and Wolfgang Maas, Santos Vempala, Mike Collins, a linguist at Columbia, Damian Tropolsky, my student. So here's our idea. First of all, let's what's the scope? People who spoke before me exclusively talked about perception. Okay, so let's decide that perception is in good hands. Okay, you know, and see what else is there. Okay, so what you perceive eventually becomes something else. Okay, and starts having an interesting inner life. And we know much less about this inner life than we know about how it gets there. Okay, so and I'm proposing let's concentrate on that. I mean, how do we do the good things? All right, I mean, not just perceiving things, but creating things. And it turns out that so what is the mechanism? I mean, we know it's neurons. Okay, we know it's molecules, but I mean, what is it really? Is there another level at which you can describe it? And our idea is that maybe it's assemblies of neurons. Okay, and assemblies of neurons, that's old news. There are populations of neurons, maybe a few tens of thousands, imprinting in the brain a memory, a concept, an idea, a story, and so on. So people, you know, we knew that these things existed, and actually we suspected it for a long time. It has been conjectured 70 years ago, but now, 15 years ago, we saw them through calcium imaging, and so this is old news. So our idea is that these things have operations, all right? I mean, so and we know that these things happen, okay? But sort of we put them together and decided to study them as a whole. They project from one brain area to another. When they realize that there is co-occurrence of these stimuli, they start intersecting more. Neurons migrate from one to the other. They pattern complete. Okay, so you know, if just one of them is a little stimulated, maybe it's going to complete and remember the whole thing. And most importantly, in humans, they can merge. Okay, so merging is something that linguists had long thought that was around. We have been observing it in the brain in the last 10 years, and we now know how to do it. Okay, with that, what I mean that these operations we have. There are two things, right? I mean, first of all, we don't pull them out of thin air. I mean, there are experiments that are best explained by assuming that assemblies do these operations. And number two, we know that they can happen in the brain. We have simulations, we have mathematical theorems that show that these things happen. And of these operations, merge is by far the most complicated. It requires a lot of plasticity, a lot of synaptic connectivity, and the coordination of 5 brain areas. And it seems plausible that only we have it. Okay, that this is something that is exclusively human. So, I guess what I'm telling you is that there are reasons to believe that these operations may underlie the higher cognitive functions of the human brain, such as language, reasoning, and so on. Okay, so and in fact, we have a proposed brain architecture that implements syntax in language. Okay, so more than 130 years ago, the two founders of neuroscience saw this picture. Okay, so they saw two different things in it. Camillo Golgi saw the whole thing and admired it as a complex and fascinating network, and said, "This is the network. This network is what we should be studying." That's called reticulism. Okay, in contrast, Ramon y Cajal saw this picture and looked at this pyramidal blot in the green circle and said, "This is the neuron, folks, and we should spend the next century studying it because the brain is made from the neuron." Okay, and they were both right, of course. Okay, they were both wrong of rejecting the other point of view. They had an epic fight at Stockholm when they both won the Nobel Prize. But in some sense, Ramon y Cajal was the right one, because there was an army of scientists ready to study the neuron and not to study the network. Okay, and the network, basically, we started studying it 70 years later. So in the work of Hubel and Peter. So I guess what I'm saying is there is maybe a third intermediate way. So that this may be an interesting level to think about. Okay, so thanks.
Thank you very much. So we're running a little bit behind time, about half an hour. So I think what I'll do is start off the Q&A sessions with some questions that I have, and then if you're also welcome to ask questions of each other. But one big question that pops up in my head is how much concrete evidence is there for the predictive brain hypothesis? So Bruno, you want to take that, and Celeste?
I think the field is slowly chipping away at it and starting to do experiments along these lines. One is just, for a long time people have tried to tease apart the effect of these top-down connections. So that diagram that I showed you, these connections between brain areas are almost two-way. So there's information flowing from low levels to higher levels, and there's information flowing back from the higher levels containing more abstract information back to the lower levels, more related to the data coming in. And so typically that's been done by cooling the higher areas and then looking at its effect on the lower areas, or knocking it out somehow and sort of teasing it apart. But the effects, the sort of measurements they've gotten from that are kind of inconclusive, because they typically use very simple stimuli, like a sine wave grating or a bar or a spot of light. And so I think from my point of view, in terms of these hypotheses, the stimuli that have been used in those experiments are simply too simple to reveal anything. So you have to sort of get like a cow on there or something like that, that kind of image. I mean, what you want to do is put the cow on and then say, okay, if I knock out this higher level area, then what changes in the lower level area? We would expect all kinds of effects. And so I think we now have the technology potentially to do those kind of experiments, using calcium imaging and other methodologies in more detail. So, but it's, we have sort of some findings from fMRI that are consistent with this idea of higher levels affecting lower level areas, but we really want to get there in there at the more detailed level, looking at individual neurons and seeing what's happening, but it's definitely possible.
Celeste, do you have anything to add?
So much. I don't know where to. I was like, where to limit? I was like, the idea that predictions drive not just infant behavior, but also behavior throughout childhood at multiple levels is pretty robust. I was like, my lab works a lot on how expectations and predictions about where you're best off learning, how that impacts attention. We have other studies where instead of it being an informational reward, it's something like stickers in a kid gambling task. Kids are good at generating expectations about where they will get the most stickers, when that varies probabilistically. That can be explained in terms of them generating predictions about what the payout is of a particular choice. There's an interesting set of evidence, I think, also from eyewitness testimony and places where memory fails. So it's like there's some work by people like Pernilla Hemmer at Rutgers that shows that when you show somebody a scene of something very common, so for example, a picture of a kitchen, what people feel like they're getting out of that is a very rich representation. They feel like they're looking around and with high fidelity encoding what they see. But you take the picture away and you ask something like, what color was the refrigerator? And people will say it was silver when there actually was no refrigerator in the photo at all. Things that are very common that you highly expect to be there, it guides your attention away from those. You don't need to check those out if you're pretty sure they're going to be there. Instead, you should be looking at the things that are not in all kitchens. That prediction is so strong that you don't notice when the refrigerator is missing. You really feel like you saw a silver refrigerator. And that's funny in a psych experiment. It's less funny when it's eyewitness testimony.
Yeah. Michael, I have a question for you. When you were tripping, did you wear eye shades, and what happened then?
I did. So I was trying to simulate the kind of research that's going on at universities testing psilocybin on people as a therapy, and also to see whether what other effects it has at various doses. But I couldn't get into those trials, so I did it with an underground therapist, so-called. And but we tried to imitate what they were doing. And one of the things they do, which I found very interesting and curious, is that you wear eye shades during the experience and listen to music on headphones. And the idea is to make you go inside. Instead of the recreational psychedelic experience, which is very much about is all this incredible sensory information coming in and how your brain processes it or misprocesses it. When you wear eye shades, not only does it tend to become a more kind of inward psychoanalytic experience, but you see things. Your mind doesn't tolerate the lack of information coming in and starts generating images. And this happens in isolation tanks too, float tanks, where if you remove all the data coming into all our senses, the brain will begin to produce stories. It's just kind of compulsive about it, of making order, given the invitation of no data. And so that's a very striking, and the change from wearing the eye shades to taking them off completely changes your reality. So it is about prediction in a sense. Your mind is making predictions based on very limited information. One of the things we haven't talked about, though, is that in this model, there's a reality is continually correcting, right?
Yes.
The predictions, right? I mean, when you talk about top down and bottom up, you're generating a prediction, and then you're getting some data to confirm you in it. Otherwise, we would all be seeing a different world. And I think that's something that goes wrong. And I really think you should think about psychedelics as a way to test these. I think it has enormous potential as a probe of this very process.
I don't think I'm going to be able to get giving psychedelics to babies past the ethics review. I like the idea in theory.
Well, as your colleague Alison Gopnik says, the babies are already tripping.
That's
right?
true. That's true.
She thinks all kids are tripping till about 4 or 5.
Yeah.
In a very precise sense, that they're that they don't have well-developed priors, and that there are predictions, and so they're taking in information in a very different way, and therefore willing to literally think outside the box because they don't have models, which makes them better performers at certain kinds of games than adults are, because they're not bound by the solution that worked well last time.
Yeah, that point I think is a really important one, and also a very interesting one, and one of the things that makes studying children so interesting. If you don't have concepts for things, it's like if you don't know what's likely and what's not, once you realize that those concepts are driving your predictions about the world, it's like it becomes easier to understand why kids sometimes expect things like monsters. Yes, when that's not something that an adult perceives. So it's like once you know that perception is noisy, yeah, kids having no concepts and trying to make sense of the world is like, I completely agree with Allison. I was like, it's akin to kids tripping, as I think you put it.
Christos, I wanted to understand from you, based on all that we've been discussing so far, the advances that are going on in machine learning and deep learning, do you see connections between what neuroscientists are saying about how the brain works and the advances that are happening in
Oh my
machine
God,
learning?
of course, of course. That there is, at some level, there is some methodological convergence. I see more and more neuroscientists when they try to find out how a system works, looking back and saying, let's see what an artificial system would evolve, by trying to do the same task. Okay, so and compare, make counter distinctions and analogies and so on. So this is now, I think, an emerging major. Am I right? That major methodology. We saw it in the segment of your work that you presented. But you see it now everywhere. Especially the younger generation of neuroscientists.
Right.
One of the things that these deep learning models are missing from the biology is the feedback connections. So they typically have just like a feed-forward flow of information. And so I think that's a very rich area to explore now, is trying to get that kind of sort of top-down inference in there. And in a sense, what you want is these deep learning machines to hallucinate, like we do, which may be a dangerous concept too.
I think there are deep learning programs that are hallucinating.
Oh, okay.
There are examples of that, yeah. This neuroscientist I mentioned to you, Anil said, I think they have in their lab some examples of imagery that is pure hallucination.
Mm.
I have seen an exhibition in this room, actually, this very room once. Yeah, so there is somebody who uses autoencoders and so on, so to create dreams.
You can write, deep dream stuff. Yeah, that's kind of that's it.
So I think before we open up the floor to questions from the audience, I just wanted to make another point about this whole idea of it might seem rather esoteric, but when I was working on my book, The Man Who Wasn't There, which is about a series of neuropsychological conditions that disturb our sense of self, one of the themes that emerged as I was looking at various conditions is the idea of the predictive brain and how this framework of thinking about what we are, who we are, as a prediction starts giving us insights into how certain people might be experiencing their condition. If you take, for example, schizophrenia, the first rank symptoms of schizophrenia involve things like hearing voices in your head that seem alien, like somebody else's voices. You can have thoughts in your head that feel, again, like somebody else's thoughts. You also have this sensation of losing control of your own actions. You might be, like for instance, if I were to pick up this glass of water, I have an implicit sensation of being the agent of my actions. I have the sensation that I am doing it. It's not even a thought in my head, it's just, that's how it feels. But for someone with schizophrenia, that very act might feel like that they haven't willed it. So it will feel like somebody else is directing their actions. And there is a way in which the predictive brain framework can be used to understand what's happening. So like even this sense of agency that we all implicitly, we take for granted, seems to be a product of the predictive brain, where if my brain is sending commands to my muscles to pick up the glass of water, it's also sending a copy of the same commands to other parts of the brain. The other parts of the brain are then making a prediction about the sensory consequences of that action. And when the sensory consequences of the action, the predicted consequences, match the actual sensory input, that is implicitly tagged as an action that I did. So it just feels like my action. But you can imagine in this whole complicated process, somewhere something goes awry, and the predicted consequences don't match the actual sensory input, and you end up with a loss of sense of agency. And you can have the sensation that you're doing something, but you're not willing it, and that then leads to downstream consequences. Like this can happen with thoughts in your head, this can happen with voices in your head, and then eventually all of this will have downstream consequences of paranoid delusions. And so again, this is not just a theoretical thing. This way of thinking has a real impact on understanding how people are suffering because of some of these conditions, including depersonalization disorder, autism. There's a whole range of things that can be understood to some degree, not entirely, but to some degree by using this framework of the predictive brain. So shall we open it up
one,
to?
I mean, one little thing to add. In the semester at the Simons Institute that we co-organized with Bruno and others, there was a little thread of computational psychiatry, and there I was very surprised to see that how they would phrase all kinds of psychosis as failures of Bayes' rule. Okay, sort of different kinds of So it was a strikingly systematic way of looking at things.
One last thing about this whole predictive brain thing. One of the most astounding outcomes of thinking about this way is that each one of us right now is experiencing being somebody, right? You're sitting in your chair, you're experiencing everything. The brain has the same mechanisms for creating your sense of self as it has for creating perceptions of something coming from outside. So you, at this point, might be your brain's best prediction of all the inputs that are coming from outside and from inside your body. So we're all predictions, and sometimes those predictions go wrong. And yeah, we'll leave it at that. We'll take questions. So if people raise their hands, we'll have the mics going out. So Drew, we can start there. Oh, sorry. There, gentleman there.
Hi. Yeah, I think that the distinction that you made at the beginning between, does the brain take bottom-up inputs and then, work from there, or does the brain make inferences from above? That's kind of an artificial distinction, I think, because both are happening all the time. I mean, reality is what goes away when you don't want it, even when you don't want it to. So, I mean, the input from the senses is constantly interacting with the mechanism that's in the brain, which is not a formal inference mechanism. It's a series of statistical co-occurrences among the neurons. And so, the fact that it can mimic logical and inferential behavior, sure, that's good for us, but it also can do not logical and not behavior. That's why we have Donald Trump. So, I think it's more fruitful to look at it as an interaction between the sensory information coming in and, what sort of statistical regularities we've learned. And I kind of agree with Daniel Dennett, is that what we call consciousness is kind of an epiphenomenon of that interaction, and it is not actually integral to it.
So,
do
you want to comment?
That seems right. I was like, it seems like it's both top down and bottom up. I don't know. Are there people that don't think that?
Well, let's see. I think it's a fair distinction in terms of the history of the field.
Right.
So
Right. Yeah.
if you just look at how the evolution of neuroscience and how things happened, I think there was definitely in the beginning a movement where people thought of neurons as feature detectors.
Right.
Right. The neurons sort of detecting a feature here, and then it passes on its feature to the next level, and then it accumulates that, sends that feature to the next level. And so that's Hubel and Wiesel's hierarchical model.
Right.
Right. Was a sort of strictly feed-forward flow, and I think it just wasn't, in the 60s and so forth when they were thinking about these things, it just wasn't on the radar screen that how much you actually had to infer things. And it was actually in part through the early efforts in computer vision in the 1960s where, at first they thought it was going to be very simple. You just hook up the camera to the computer and then do some logic and it's going to work. And they realized that even the problem of, finding the edges, the contours of an object in the image was extremely difficult, and how much that relied upon high-level knowledge to interpret that. And that was maybe the beginnings, and it's still kind of a relative, but I think it's slowly, people now more or less think of it that way. I don't think it's so much it's not friction about that there's high-level top. No, I think it's just more a matter of like the nuts and bolts of how does that actually work, how would you design an experiment to tease it apart and so forth.
Well, and how does it change across contexts? It's like even within the same task, depending upon the information you have available, it's like you may be using more bottom-up or top-down. All of this is probabilistic. So yeah, I think that's not a contentious point. We agree.
No matter how much I want to see something with this eye, I can't.
Yeah. So up there, the lady in the striped T-shirt.
Hi, so I have two questions. The first one's for Professor Kidd. and that comes to when adults are learning foreign languages, and I find, because I'm currently learning my boyfriend's language, Norwegian, and I find it very difficult when I'm hearing Norwegians speak. It really just sounds like a giant amalgamation of sounds, and I have no idea. So has anyone done any research on how, since our brains are so much more advanced now, is there any different way that we do this compared to when babies are learning their first language? And my second question is to just generally when it comes to bias, since it seems like there's a predictive element in that, has anyone studied how the predictive brain plays a role in the biases that we carry and how we use that to judge people or situations? Thank you.
So for that first question, there's all sorts of cues besides just the statistics of the syllables that we know are used in parsing a continuous speech stream into the words. That's a great example. It's very hard to pull out just one word for a language that you don't have a lot of experience with. There's cues like, one of the ones that we've studied in my lab, that maybe this will actually be helpful. We know babies pick up on it, but once you're an adult that has another language, it's hard to go back and reattend to the low-level stuff like statistics between the syllables. Speech disfluencies are universal, so sounds like and they always occur before a word, particularly before words that are not very predictable. So if I'm talking, it would be very unlikely that I would say, could you hand me the cup? That's a pretty easy word to say. For something like monitor that's less frequent, as it's more likely that an is going to refer to a weirder thing. So if you're listening to your boyfriend talk and you hear an it's like babies pay attention. You can pay attention too. You have at least one half of the word there. I was like, that's a sign that it's a word boundary. And those often occur at the end of a sentence. So there's a tip. In terms of, I feel like that's a question that could be like its own session.
I agree.
There's all kinds of differences between how an infant approaches language and an adult, and it likely has to do with your expectations and also your abilities. So it's like as an adult, when I traveled to a foreign country, one of the first things that struck me the first time I did it is how little language I actually need because I have the adult ability to point and use pragmatics to convey what I need, where an infant who cannot move or even not hit themselves in the face with a rattle is way more dependent on adults. They really need language to get what they want. So there is no experiment. The experiment you want is making an adult both cute, but also as dependent on other people without motor and pragmatic abilities. It's like if you did that and then they still couldn't learn language, that would tell you something about brain plasticity. But given that it's really hard to come up with an ethical setup to make that happen, we don't know.
The second part of the question about biases, anyone want to take it? Can I venture something? Yeah. So, apparently the thesis here is that the brain is good at predicting at the neuron level. Okay, if you go to the macro level, I think as a species we are remarkably bad at predicting. Okay, so or arguing probabilistically, if anybody, I don't know how many of you have tried to teach students probability. It's the hardest subject, okay, especially Bayes' rule. Okay, so it's I think we are very bad predictors at the macro level. Okay, so it could be that we have been selected for that, right? I mean, because don't forget, so if we are here, it means that 3,000 of a few thousands of our ancestors decided to do something really stupid, to leave the village where they are, and then cross the mountains for the next valley. Okay, so that's so they were probably predicting wrong. Okay, so that's,
I mean, we seemingly wired for making short-term predictions well, but long-term, I mean, climate change is one obvious thing where we're completely losing the plot. So, anyone else? Right there. Drew? This gentleman there. And we had one question from the very beginning.
So I want to thank the panelists for a very stimulating discussion. So it seems like, you know, humans and babies are very adept at learning to classify objects using just a few examples, and whereas kind of state-of-the-art deep learning techniques might require hundreds of thousands or millions of labeled examples before they can effectively classify at the same level of accuracy or something close to that. So can biology or neuroscience kind of shed light on how we might kind of, you know, use how, you know, methodologies that humans might use for learning and kind of imbue those in kind of deep learning or machine learning?
Bruno or Christos?
I happen to be a little skeptical as to, you know, I've also studied evolution in other life. I mean, so you know, our brain has evolved. Okay, you know, it had very, very, very poor materials to evolve from. Okay, so you know, whatever corner of the possibilities it ended up, so you know, it's not likely to be optimal. So you know, in other words, I don't think that there are going to be major insights that will be useful for computation that come from the way the brain works. Okay, so you know, and I mean, no, as you probably know very well, what the artificial neural nets, the way they work, has you know, violates a lot of the ways that actual neurons work. You know, that for example, the hierarchy that Bruno showed us works. So you know, these days when you write a research proposal about the brain, you are almost obliged to say that maybe some of these lessons will be used one day to build better computer systems. Okay, so you know, but I always do it with some skepticism.
Yeah, I think one thing we can incorporate from biology, I think, on this is that the brain is constantly learning at all time scales. So from adaptation that occurs on the order of seconds to learning things over your lifetime. And these are biophysical processes that occur in the brain, the changes in the plasticity that we know is happening all these different time scales. And one of the sort of challenges sort of creeping in now to machine learning and deep learning is the problem of what they call stationarity. And so typically when people train their algorithms, they sort of have a big data set, like a batch, and they just train it on this big batch. And it learns about apples or whatever. And then now if you wanted to learn something else, you have to sort of give it a new batch of data. Well, now it's going to forget the old batch. And so how do you keep the old stuff that you learned around while still learning new stuff? And so this is something the brain excels at and can sort of adapt and learn stuff over a lifetime without forgetting things. So I think that, you know, and sort of gleaning something from these different time scales and putting those into networks, I think is one thing that could help.
That point about the data sets that are used, I think, is something that also is changing. I think when people first started using the term child-inspired AI, they had that same sort of intuition you did. Kids can learn things relatively quickly from just a few instances. We have the internet now with all sorts of everything on Google Images. I was like, surely we can do at least as well as a kid. There's a new appreciation that I'm hearing acknowledged more in just the past few years, which is the type of data. It's not just the amount that you have, it's what you have. And if you think about a kid going around the world, they have the ability to elicit stuff that Google Images, if you're training a model, I was like, you have what's there and that's it. Kids have the ability to be cute and get more evidence. That's one major thing going for them. But then also if you think about every time they place their eye on something and they fixate something, each moment is another piece of data. Think about what just those images look like, what's on their visual field. that's very different. That's much richer than what's available on Google Images. So I would expect that there's going to be a shift to stop thinking about kids as smart inferences from smaller data sets. So it's like they definitely can do that in ways that I think my Google Home could learn from. My 2.5-year-old is only 2.5 and is better at answering questions than the Google Home. There's something to that, but I think there also is going to be a shift towards appreciating exactly how much data a 2.5-year-old has, and that it's a different type qualitatively and quantitatively from what we have been using to train these models.
We have time for one more question, so we'll go right out there. The gentleman in the yellow, black check shirt.
I had a question about thinking about the brain in formal systems. And so especially for thinking about the human brain versus other brains and thinking about how there might be operations that are unique to the human brain, how do you think about those operations as stemming from some physical thing within the brain that is present in human brains and not in a mouse brain or a fly brain or what have you?
Thank you, I understand. So in particular, I spoke about this complicated operation called the merge, something that Chomsky had predicted in the 60s. And now we get some evidence from experiments that merge does happen in the brain in connection to language. So on the basis of very flimsy evidence, I venture to conjecture that merge is something that is exclusive to humans. And here is the only evidence that I have, right? I mean, that there is a neural superhighway, sort of, a very, very potent fiber connecting essentially the superior temporal gyrus with the prefrontal cortex, and it's called the arcuate fasciculus, and this is the only place where there is left-right symmetry, lateralization, anatomical lateralization in the mammalian brain. And it pertains to the circuits that we have believed for almost 150 years that have to do with language, okay, with syntax. In particular, it goes from the place where words seem to be dealt with to the place where sentences and phrases seem to be dealt with. So that's this is the. You asked me about the anatomical difference, okay? This is something that we know, that there is something there.
I'd just add something to that too. Another network in the brain that doesn't appear to be in animals is the default mode network, which is partly implicated in that, and that this is a set of tightly linked structures in the midline that connect the cortex to older, deeper areas of memory and emotion, and is involved in generating the sense of self. It's where self-reflection takes place, time travel, a lot of higher metacognitive processes. And it's interesting when that goes offline, as it does during psychedelic experience or high-dose psychedelic experience, you experience a loss of a sense of self. There's this sense that yourself merges into something larger. And,
have they seen a visible difference in the default mode?
The first, when they've started imaging the brains of people on psilocybin and LSD, they really expected to see an explosion of activity all over the brain. They were very surprised to see that the default mode network was down-regulated dramatically. An effect that's also observed during meditation. If you put a very experienced meditator in an fMRI, that part of the brain will also go quiet. So that kind of sense of a self, of an ego, may be something that we don't share. And the default mode network, I believe, doesn't develop in children until pretty late in development.
Till about 4 to 6 or something.
Yeah,
There's also.
oh, sorry. Oh yeah. I was like that's consistent with what I. So I'm not sure about that, but that's like the kids are not good at representing themselves as people in time and space. And they're also really bad at representing other people. Like that's completely consistent with that being true.
And there's a, sorry.
It's also interesting that, what you said about that also the apparatus that I talked about, the quadrifasciculus, is apparently is myelinated during the 20th month of life, which is exactly when sentences start to be formed. Yes.
Interesting. There's also a very intriguing condition called Cotard syndrome, where people who have that condition think that they're dead, that they really believe that they don't exist. And the default mode network again gets implicated in that. It's depressed, the activity in the default mode network is depressed down to the levels that you would see in people with extreme depression. So something about the default mode network which is involved in creating your, like you said, your sense of self. In Cotard syndrome, that activity is diminished tremendously.
There is apparently, I think it's anecdotal, there is anecdotal evidence that when a large group of people attend, maybe see a movie or maybe even a lecture, so their default modes networks are synchronized. So watch out.
I can feel that right now. So unfortunately, we've run out of time. I think we can keep going with this for a long time. The questions are such. But thank you very much for coming.
So the default mode